On December 7, 1941, the American naval base Pearl Harbor was attacked by the Japanese Empire. This led to the questioning of the loyalty of Japanese Americans. Would they be loyal to their homeland or to the United States of America? The Munson Report, which was compiled a few months before the attack, found the majority of Japanese Americans to be loyal to America, posing no threat during time of war. However, this did not prevent the government from targeting them and questioning their loyalty after the attack. The actions of the government towards Japanese Americans following the attack on Pearl Harbor was a revolutionary action against the Constitution of the United States and violated rights of citizens. Earl Warren, who was the Attorney General of California, advocated for the relocation and internment of those of Japanese descent. The government and Warren were never able to fully justify the actions performed towards the Japanese Americans. There was not a single incident of them committing treason or espionage. Warren claimed that it seemed to be the right decision at the time. However, his later decisions as Chief Justice suggest a feeling of guilt. Did his guilt result from his decisions to push for the internment of Japanese Americans? Earl Warren began his political career as a man of action, pushing for the internment of Japanese Americans, and ended as a man of reflection through the liberal Warren Court, which led to an era of revolutionary racial equality. In February of 1942, Earl Warren stated that the Japanese situation as it exists today in this state may well be the Achilles heel of the entire civilian defense effort. It is arguable that he may have played to popular racism in order to further his political career since he was running for governor of California, but his actions to advocate against the Japanese Americans were vital to their internment and the discrimination towards them. John L. DeWitt, the general of the Western Defense Command, also pushed for action against the Japanese Americans. President Franklin Roosevelt signed the Executive Order of 9066 on February 19, 1942, which authorized the establishment of military areas and the exclusion of Japanese Americans from the West Coast area. General Eisenhower, who later selected Earl Warren as Chief Justice, was appointed to head the War Relocation Authority, which operated the internment camps. The first removal of Japanese Americans took place on March 22, 1942. The relocation and internment weren't the only acts against them. The government began interrogating those of Japanese descent because they were viewed as a threat. The Hirabayashi case of 1943 began when Gordon Hirabayashi refused to follow the curfew laws set up by the government because he believed they violated his rights as an American citizen. On May 19, 1942, the Korematsu case began. Fred Korematsu refused to relocate into the internment camps. By doing so, he had violated the order and therefore was put on a 5-year probation. Korematsu argued that this violated the Fifth Amendment, which contains a clause for protection against the abuse of government. Still, the court ruled the order to be constitutional, stating that the protection of the United States as a whole was a greater priority than the protection of one man's rights. In 1952, Earl Warren was appointed as the Supreme Court Chief Justice by President Eisenhower. The Warren Court was known for its numerous rulings that shaped civil rights. One of the most significant cases was Brown v. Board of Education.
That was inconsistent with his career record, and it was something that he regretted soon afterwards. And I think it could have been that one event that inspired him to push a case such as Brown versus the Board of Education later on in his career.
This started in Topeka, Kansas, when an African-American girl, Linda Brown, had to walk a mile to her segregated school rather than going to a white school 7 blocks away. Her father, Oliver Brown, along with 12 other families and the Topeka branch of the NAACP, sought to bring this case to the court for the justice and equality for African Americans. At first, the court could not come to a consensus, but in the case of Brown v. Board of Education II, it was decided that in the field of public education, the separate but equal doctrine had no place. Earl Warren also pushed for complete unanimity in favor of Brown and convinced the case's main opponent, Stanley Reed. The aftermath led the movement for the desegregation of schools across America and was vital to the growth of the civil rights movement. The desegregation of schools happened gradually. After a decade, there was desegregation in only 2% of the school districts. Regardless, it had a ripple effect throughout America. It led to the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act. Warren stated that separate but equal learning facilities were a violation of the 14th Amendment. This act demonstrated Warren's position in favor of the assimilation of African Americans into American society.
Warren Courts was a leader in civil rights, certainly in the racial area, certainly in voting rights. And I think that the congressional legislation which followed, the Civil Rights Act of 1965, which went beyond what the court was doing, was inspired by what the court had decided and the basic principles that were laid down.
In Reynolds v. Sims, Warren supported the doctrine of equal protection under the law. In 1960, the unfair appointment of legislators based on the 1900 rather than the 1960 census created a scandal. The district used the 1900 census to limit African Americans to the same number of legislators 60 years before. The Supreme Court's final say was that the privilege to vote was a fundamental American right, and every vote should be equal in importance. Earl Warren argued that legislators represent people, not trees or acres. He supported the equal representation of people under the law and advocated to uphold the 15th Amendment, which barred the denial of the vote on the basis of race. In the case of Gamillion v. Lightfoot, there was a dispute over territorial markings. In an attempt to disenfranchise black voters, the state of Alabama reconfigured the boundaries of the city of Tuskegee from a square shape to a figure with 28 sides, which resulted in the exclusion of 5 black voters. The Supreme Court unanimously ruled the act to be unconstitutional. In 1960, a case of racial segregation in public transportation, Boynton v. Virginia, was taken to the Supreme Court. The court ruled that restaurants and bus terminals could not discriminate against blacks if they were created to serve interstate bus passengers. The freedom rides on interstate buses by civil rights activists soon followed this case, testing its authority. There were many civil rights cases during Warren's court. Did his guilt from advocating the internment of Japanese Americans cause him to favor the rights of the African Americans in an attempt to right his wrongs, or was this simply a transformation of a politician? In 1968, the government began paying reparations to Japanese Americans. This was not the last time the American government would apologize for their actions.
What's interesting is that there's a parallel between that and what happened with the United States. Here in 1941, we started in World War II, and we had Pearl Harbor, and we did something terrible to Japanese Americans. Years later, in 1988, the nation saw that it had done wrong. Were we guilty? Did we have a feeling of guilt? Maybe, but it was also a transformation of understanding what civil liberties was all about. And we were able to apologize as a nation and pass the Civil Liberties Act.
On February 25, 1983, the government officially announced that a grave injustice was done to American citizens and resident aliens of Japanese ancestry, who, without any individual review or any evidence against them, were excluded, removed, and detained by the United States. In 1988, President Reagan delivered a public apology to the descendants of internment victims and signed the Civil Liberties Act, which included a payment of $20,000 to every surviving victim of the camps. These funds allowed for an education program to teach people about this period of history and prevent the occurrence of any similar abuses in the future.
A transformation of an intelligent, involved person in civil affairs, right? Who, through his transformation, through his growth, realized years later, I had made a mistake.
A paradoxical mystery surrounds Earl Warren's character and actions. Once branded as a man of mediocrity, the great moral responsibility that came with the title of Supreme Court Chief Justice brought out a conscientious man. In the beginning, Earl Warren may have been inclined to advocate the relocation and internment of Japanese Americans. But through his transformation, Earl Warren began fighting for civil rights and paving the way for the movement. A year after Eisenhower had appointed Warren as Chief Justice, he deeply regretted his decision because he believed he selected a safe, moderate conservative. Warren, however, proved to be the crusading liberal Eisenhower hoped to steer clear of. Warren's actions were truly revolutionary.